Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakio. Thank you for joining me this evening for Dharma Sunday, where we take canonical Buddhist teachings and tie them with real-world events. These teachings are offered free of charge, but if you'd like to make a contribution, information for that is available, PayPal and Cash App, in the description for this talk. If you'd like to do a deep dive into Buddhist training, check out my book, Perfectly Ordinary Buddhist Teachings for Everyday Life. There's a link to a sample chapter of the book also in the description for this talk, and it's available everywhere books are sold. Finally, if you'd like to be updated when I post live streams in the future, please make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be notified when I go live. It's also helpful if you hit the notification bell. So this evening, we'll be talking about an issue that's very dear and near to my heart, and that's ecology and nature. One of the things I love more than anything is being in the outdoors, whether I'm hiking or gardening or riding my bike. So the natural world and the ecosphere that we live in is very important to me. So I was very heartened when I read an article earlier today, it seems to be a couple years old, about the rewilding of wolves in Yellowstone. And humans and wolves, especially in the US, have a very poor history. There have been a couple times where we've hunted them to near extinction in many parts of the US. And they are still extinct geographically in certain places. They used to be in every state in the US, and now they're only in a select few. But that's slowly changing, and one example is the rewilding of Yellowstone National Park, with wolves being introduced about 25 years ago. So I'm going to read an article from The Guardian that discusses the reintroduction of the wolves, the effects that has had on the ecosphere in Yellowstone, and then offer some Buddhist teachings around how we can deal with the metaphorical wolves we deal with in our own lives and the effects that they can have on the ecology of our spiritual practice. So, like I said, this article is at theguardian.com. It was written by Cassidy Randall. Looks like it's from 2020, so not that long ago. It's called A Rewilding Triumph. Wolves help to reverse Yellowstone degradation. 25 years ago, the national park attempted to reintroduce wolves. Now scientists are celebrating as one of the greatest rewilding stories ever. And so that's the caption for a picture. And then the article states, 25 years ago this month, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, America's first national park, and an ecosystem dangerously out of whack owing to the extirpation of its top predator. The monumental undertaking marked the first deliberate attempt to return a top-level carnivore to a large ecosystem. Now scientists are celebrating the gray wolf's successful return from the brink of extinction as one of the greatest rewilding stories the world has ever seen. The pressure was huge with this project, said Doug Smith, the senior wildlife biologist of the Yellowstone Wolf Project, who was hired by the National Park Service to head the reintroduction in the 1990s. If we couldn't do this here, on our own turf, in one of the most famous parks in the world, as one of the richest nations in the world, then who could? This was an example to the globe in restoring nature. But because wolves are one of the most controversial animals on the planet, the recovery remains fiercely contested. Wolves once roamed from the Arctic to Mexico, but they were hunted to eradication across the country from the 1870s onward. By 1926, the last wolf pack had been killed in Yellowstone by park employees as part of the policy of the time to eliminate all predators. They were mythologized as a danger to humans, a menace to the ranchers settling the West, in competition for big game hunters. That mythology still persists to this day. Although wolves very rarely attack people, especially compared with cougars and bears, wolves kill 0.2% to 0.3% of available livestock. When the Endangered Species Act, ESA, was enacted in the 70s, Wolves are among the original species on the list. The ESA, a landmark piece of legislation to save declining species from extinction, compels the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect endangered or threatened species and develop a plan for their recovery. But because wolves are so polarizing, the reintroduction did not take place until more than 20 years later. The need for restoration was glaring. In the 70 years of the wolf's absence, the entire Yellowstone ecosystem had fallen out of balance. Coyotes ran rampant, the elk population exploded, overgrazing willows and aspens. Without those trees, songbirds began to decline. Beavers could no longer build their dams, and riverbanks started to erode. Without beaver dams, the shade from trees and other plants, water temperatures were too high for cold water fish. In 1995, in collaboration with Canadian agencies, 14 wolves were captured in Jasper National Park and brought to Yellowstone. Smith recalls that as they transport the wolves through the park in horse trailers, people lined the roads to be part of the historic event. Every time we stopped, visitors would come up and ask if they could pose next to the trailer. They couldn't even see the wolves in there, but people wanted photos. That's the presence and magic that wolves have. That's the first time we all felt that. In Yellowstone, the wolves were kept in acclimation pens for several weeks to keep their homing instincts from leading them back to Canada. Shortly after the pens were opened, though, wolf number 10 headed north and crossed the border into Montana, followed by number 9, his mate, pregnant with pups. He was illegally shot by a rancher, but she and her 8 pups were rescued and moved back to the safety of park boundaries. Their bloodline can be traced to most of the wolves in the park to this day. Scientists always knew that as the top predator, wolves were the missing piece in this ecosystem, but they were astonished at how quickly their return stimulated a transformation. The elk and deer population started responding immediately. Within about 10 years, willows rebounded. In 20, the aspen began flourishing. Riverbanks stabilized. Songbirds returned, as did beavers, eagles, foxes, and badgers. And those are just the things we have the time and funding to study, said Smith. There are probably myriad other effects just waiting to be discovered. While the restoration of wolves in Yellowstone has cost about $30 million, wolf ecotourism brings in $35 million annually, an economic boom for the surrounding communities. Yellowstone is unique in the world as the best place to observe wolves, which are generally shy, reclusive, and favor remote areas. This is as true for scientists as it is for tourists. And as a result, wolf research in the park is considered far more advanced than anywhere else. It truly is going to go down in my career as one of those defining moments I was proud of to be part of from the beginning. That's shaping the politics of conservation, said Jamie Rappaport, Clark president and CEO of Defenders of Wildlife, which organized the political support and legal actions for reintroduction and remains committed to restoring wolves to their historic ranges. At the same time, it's not finished. We have not restored wolves to where they can and should be, where it's ecologically correct. We still have a lot of conflict and concerns. If state plans weren't so over-controlling, wolves would be running over the spine of the Rockies into the Southwest today. When wolves were deemed recovered enough to be removed from the endangered species list, management of populations was left to each state. In Wyoming, people are allowed to shoot wolves on site outside the borders of national parks. In Montana, it is permissible with a hunting permit. Regardless of the challenges ahead, the thriving wolves in Yellowstone illustrate the success of the Endangered Species Act as a framework to conserve biodiversity and a hopeful example at a time when the UN has revealed that the planet is on the brink of the 6th mass extinction. Absent the ESA, I am certain that wolves would never have come back, said Clark. Nearly 2,000 species would likely be extinct if they didn't have the backstop of the ESA, which is this country's commitment to the conservation and restoration of biodiversity within our borders. It's our conscience, our reminder that we're responsible for maintaining a healthy planet now and in the future. So that's the article from The Guardian. And like I said, this is an issue very near and dear to my heart. I have been involved in ecology and biodiversity and nature studies and protection literally since I was a child. When I was a Boy Scout going out into the woods to observe animals and earn merit badges, right? So when I read this article, it struck me for a couple of reasons. One, I was really happy that the wolves were returning to Yellowstone and they were thriving. But it also struck me that we have this idea of wolves as being these dangerous, evil creatures. And yet, when they were invited back into the park, they rebuilt a lot of things, like the article says. When the elk and the coyote populations came back under control, then the willows and the aspens were able to grow because they were being overgrazed by the elk. And when those trees came back, the temperature in the water lowered because there was more shade, so there was a better fish population. The beavers had things they could use to build dams, and they built those dams, which created shallow areas for the willows and the aspens to grow. So it's a really wonderful compounding effect, right? This one creature is taken out of Yellowstone, everything falls apart. This one creature, the wolf, is brought back to Yellowstone, everything improves. And this is interesting because we as human beings, again, being scared of carnivores, being scared of predators, think that if there were no more wolves in the world, everything would be better. If there were no more lions or tigers or bears, we'd all be safe. And what the article shows is that we need these animals. We need these apex predators, not only for our own survival, but for the survival of Mother Nature itself. The elk that are eaten by the wolves, the beavers, and the fish sometimes are eaten by the wolves, actually need those wolves there to survive, to thrive. Fascinating. And that got me thinking about other things that we have in our lives that we think we'd be better without, but probably we need, even if they don't make our lives that much easier. I think about the first noble truth, which says life is suffering. And on the surface, that sounds terrible. Life is suffering. Why would you want to live if life is suffering? And of course, there's more nuance to it. Life is suffering, but on the other side of that suffering is joy. And as we accept our suffering, we experience the joy more fully, etc., etc. I've talked about that a lot in previous videos. But what I want to talk about today is the fact that our suffering is necessary for our enlightenment. In the same way that the wolf is necessary for the health and safety of Yellowstone National Park. Now, that doesn't mean that the elk want to be eaten and that they allow themselves to be eaten by wolves. No, when they're hunted, they run away. We don't want to suffer, and we rightly try to not suffer in our lives. But one way I've found to deal with my suffering more effectively is to realize that it's a natural part of life, and that sometimes, if I work with it skillfully, it can be a very healthy part of life because it drives me to make better decisions. So just as a simple example, I remember several years ago when I still drank alcohol, I went out with my friends and we had a night and I didn't get home until 5 a.m. and I had this terrible, terrible hangover the next day. One of those can't get out of bed, the TV is too loud, so you just stare at the wall, head throbbing hangovers, suffering terribly. But that hangover is one of the things that drove me to eventually stop drinking alcohol, which has been very beneficial in my life. Now, does that mean everyone should stop drinking? No. We all need to make our own decision in terms of what Buddha said when he said to not abuse intoxicants. But in my own life, the suffering I had from my drinking is what helped me to stop drinking. And by not drinking anymore, I've been able to lead a healthier, happier life. So sometimes our suffering is there as a guide, as a teacher, as a reminder that, hey, what you're doing right now isn't healthy. It isn't good. It isn't proper. Not to say that you're a bad person, but just, hey, maybe you can try something else. So it's necessary in the same way that it's necessary for some elk and some coyote and some fish to be killed by wolves in order for the Yellowstone ecology to flourish and thrive. Sometimes our own suffering is necessary for us to flourish and thrive, for us to throw off the shackles of samsara and move on to bigger and better things. Also, sometimes the suffering is necessary because there's a reward at the end of it. I think of exercise. I think of cutting the grass, which I did today. It was quite hot and it was very unpleasant. And I actually like mowing, but it was just hot and sweaty, and the mower was blowing grass and dandelion seeds into my face, so I was coughing. So I was suffering as I was mowing the grass. But that suffering, at the end of it, now I have a lawn that's mowed and my neighbors won't be mad at me, and it looks nice to look at, and it's easy to walk around in, and it's better. So the suffering, while unpleasant, while not something that I wanted in that moment, led to something good. So that's another way we can deal with our suffering, is to remind ourselves that, yeah, maybe this is unpleasant in the moment, but maybe this is simply currency. Maybe this is simply the price I'm paying for something better in the future. Exercise is another example of this. Exercise can be very unpleasant. I went on a lot of runs when I was in the Marine Corps, and I hated most of them. But all that pain you endure, the not being able to breathe, the sore muscles, what does it lead to? It leads to a stronger, healthier body. The suffering is necessary for our joy. Now, I wanted to stop here and say we don't need to unnecessarily add suffering to our lives. I'm thinking of a quote from Venerable Shi Fa, one of my teachers, a Chan Buddhist monk, who said, we don't need to add suffering. Life gives us plenty to work with. And that's true for us as well. We don't need to do anything special. We don't need to do any ascetic practices, not eating, not sleeping, things of that nature. We simply need to look at the suffering we already have in our lives and decide, what can I do with this? How can this help me grow? And when we change our thinking that way, when we change our mindset from suffering is bad to suffering could be useful if I look at it the correct way. This is why the first tenet of the Noble Eightfold Path is right view. Everything changes. Things are unpleasant, and they're allowed to be unpleasant, but we're able to get something useful out of them, whether it's a spiritual teaching, whether it's the opportunity to practice patience or endurance, whether it's the awakening of our enlightenment, of stronger physical body. If we look at our suffering skillfully, we're able to work with it skillfully. In the same way that when we as a nation start looking at wolves skillfully, not seeing them as this big bad monster, but as a necessary part of the ecosystem, we were able to reintroduce them back into Yellowstone, and all of these great things started to happen in this chain of events. So that's the first thing I take from this article, that we should rethink the way we view suffering. The first noble truth isn't there to warn us per se, it's there to remind us that life gives us all the fuel we need for our enlightenment. We just have to light the match. Look at the Buddha. He lived a life when he was younger that had no suffering, or I should say very little. I'm sure there was some, but his father did everything he could to ensure that his son did not suffer. He had the best teachers, the best scholars, access to everything he could possibly want. Food, sleep, shelter, medicine. But I would wager to say, just conjecture on my part, that his father's actions actually made him less happy instead of more. Because the prince, Siddhartha Gautama, had all of this cool stuff, and yet he wasn't satisfied. So instead of stopping his son from becoming a holy man, as the oracle predicted, he probably drove him to the spiritual path. Because by a very young age, Siddhartha had figured out, I've tried everything available in this kingdom and nothing is working. The money doesn't work, the clothes don't work, the friends, I'm still suffering, I'm still unhappy. Maybe I need to try spirituality instead. Now, we do this on a much smaller scale, but we do the same thing. We think that if I buy the new car, if I get the new, they don't do CDs anymore, but if I get this new music downloaded to my computer, if I get the new house, if I get the new job, then that will magically make my life better. And that's not the case. Life is suffering. And life is joyful if we're able to work with our suffering skillfully. So that's the first thing I take from the article. The second thing I take from it is the incredible importance one individual or one species in this way has on the rest of the universe, or in this microcosm on Yellowstone. Because according to the article, all they did was bring the wolves back to the park. I'm sure they were doing other things at the time, but the point is, this one species out of the tens of thousands that are in the park, the birds, the bees, the beavers, the multitude of plant life, had such a huge impact on everything else. And I guarantee the wolves aren't running around thinking, I really hope I can get this park back to where it used to be. I guarantee the wolves are thinking, man, I really hope I can help those beavers out. They need those willows and those aspen to build their dams. I can help. Let's see what we can do. No, all the wolves are doing is going through Yellowstone, living their lives, living in accordance to their wolf nature. That's it. No more, no less. And yet, simply doing that has such a huge enlivening effect on the park that 25 years later, they're trying to recreate that in other places. Now, if a wolf can do that simply by acting in accordance with their wolf nature, imagine what we can do if we act in accordance with our Buddha nature. Because remember, the sutras tell us we are all enlightened beings. We are all members of the Buddha body. Our practice is not to become enlightened, it's simply to actualize the enlightenment we already have, to act out our Buddha nature in daily life. That's it. So if a wolf acting on its wolf nature can turn Yellowstone around, imagine what you can do acting out your Buddha nature. Imagine what you've already done. Now, you probably don't know what you've done and what you've accomplished and what you've helped, just like the wolves don't know what they've done and what they've accomplished and what they've helped. But it doesn't change the fact that it's there. It doesn't change the fact that they are integral parts of the puzzle. You are an integral part of the puzzle. You acting in alignment with your Buddha nature will end suffering for countless sentient beings in the same way that the wolves acting in accordance with their wolf nature end suffering for countless sentient beings in Yellowstone. And this is important because we as human beings often don't think on that larger scale. We think that our actions don't affect anything outside of our small circle. We think that our lives don't matter. But what I take from this article is that everything and everyone matters. Everyone is incredibly important. That's why when we look at the bodhisattvas, when we look at Kannan, the bodhisattva of compassion, when we look at Jizo, the bodhisattva of hell beings, when we look at Manju, the bodhisattva of wisdom, Amida, the Buddha of infinite light. This is why they take vows to save all sentient beings from suffering, because they know, even if we don't, that all sentient beings are important. You're important. Your life matters. Your practice matters. And even if you don't know the effects of you sitting on the cushion for 5 minutes, or chanting in front of your altar, or doing prostrations, or visiting the temple, or listening to a Dharma talk, we know from the sutras, we know from the article that our actions, our karma, reverberates out into the universe. And as it goes out into the universe, it makes things better in accordance with our actions. So our practice is so important, not just for us, but for all sentient beings. And in a traditional Buddhist ceremony, at the end, we often do a dedication of merit where we say, may the merit of this practice benefit all beings. And those aren't just words. It's a reminder that our practice has already benefited all sentient beings from this moment on to the end of time. And again, like the wolves, we will not know every one that benefits from our practice. We don't know who benefits every time we're kind to the cashier, every time we check on a loved one, every time we tell our significant others, hey, thank you for doing that for me today. We don't know. We're humans. We can't know. But we know that it happens. The sutras tell us this, and we see it again via microcosm with the wolves in Yellowstone, who simply by existing, by living in accordance with their own wolf nature, changed everything. And we, again, I'm going to keep saying this because it's important, by living in accordance with our Buddha nature, change everything. We are so important, so special, in spite of everything our culture tells us. This is why karma is so important in Buddhism. Because it's not just our karma, it's the world's karma. Our little ecosystem, whether it's a house or a town or a country or a company, gets better or worse through our actions. If we want to change the world, all we need to do is change ourselves. And if we want to make the world a better place, all we need to do is make ourselves better by, again, acting in accordance with our Buddha nature. Amitabha. So that's the talk for today. I hope it was helpful. We're now going to move into the Q&A portion of tonight's chat. This is your opportunity to ask me questions, either about the article, about my Dharma talk, or if you just have questions about Buddhism in general, comments you'd like to share with the rest of the Sangha, type those into the live chat. I'll be sure to respond. While we're waiting for those to come in, I'll just make a few announcements. So this is Dharma Sunday. We do it via live stream at this channel every Sunday, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Generally what happens is I'll read an article relating to real world events, do a Dharma talk that relates to the article, and then we'll have a Q&A. On Wednesdays, we do meditation and sutra study. During that, it's a little bit more involved. We do a 15-minute guided meditation, a reading from a sutra. Next, we'll be reading from the Nirvana Sutra, starting this coming Wednesday. Then there's also a Dharma talk, again followed by a Q&A. These teachings are offered at no charge, but if you'd like to make a contribution, information for PayPal and Cash App are in the description for this talk. So let's see. Loity says, good afternoon, Sensei. Appreciate your work. I can't stay, but I will watch later. Well, thank you, Loity. I appreciate that. Of course, these talks are recorded, so if you can't stay, it's not a worry or a concern. Simply watch after the fact. And if you have comments or questions you'd like me to address outside of the live stream, just leave that in the comments section and I'll respond. Thank you. Great Hermit said, good evening, Sensei, with the bow emoji. And then you also said, I only have a few pages left in your book. Oh, thank you, Great Hermit. Good evening to you as well. Glad to see you're enjoying the book. Allison Griffin said, yes, voters in Colorado passed a ballot measure last year directing the state to reintroduce wolves. That is so wonderful. I love that. I remember as a child, we read about the wolves being on the brink of extinction and being shot and hunted and eradicated. And it's just lovely to see that the pendulum is slowly moving in the opposite direction. So, yay for the voters of Colorado. Great Hermit said, Sensei, how do you keep a balanced life? So that's a good question. And it's not one that's easily answered. I asked a similar question once of Venerable Shi Fa. So I'm just going to tell you what he told me. And that is that balance, as it's understood in Buddhism, is not the same as the way we generally understand it in the West. It's not 50 pounds over here, 50 pounds over here. We're balanced. Whether it's a moving thing. So sometimes it's 60-40, sometimes it's 70-30, and we move back and forth as we need to, as the situation dictates. And this is the flow that you learn in Chan Buddhism. It's a teaching that's very, it's interesting. It's very strict, Chan Buddhism in some ways, but it's also very flowing in other ways. That moving balance, what's needed in this moment. And maintaining a balanced life, I think, is about that. It's about fluidity. It's about paying close attention, seeing what's happening, and then making choices as a result. So there may be times when we have to do all of our attention towards Buddhist training and less towards regular life. There may be other times where we're more focused on regular life and we're doing less of the traditional spiritual practices. Obviously, we're always doing a little bit of one of the two, but we move back and forth as needed. So I would say the key to living a balanced life is to maintain that fluidity and to pay attention to know what's needed in the moment. Good question. Kendra Jones said, who do Buddhists pray to? Do they believe in God or Jesus? Well, that's a good question, Kendra. Thank you for asking. Welcome back. So I hate using this phrase, but I think I have to in this situation, is it depends on the Buddhist. So God and Jesus aren't part of traditional Buddhist practice. I assume by when you say God, you mean the Christian God. Buddhism existed 500 years before Christianity, so it wasn't really a thing back then. So how that works in a person's own personal practice, however, varies. So there are Buddhists who are atheist. A lot of secular Buddhists fall into that category. There are Buddhists who are very deeply religious. However, they pray to and chant to more traditionally Asian deities, some of which I mentioned earlier, Kannon, Jizo, Manju, Amida, etc. And there are also Christian Buddhists as well. So Thomas Merton comes to mind. He was if I remember correctly, a Franciscan friar. So very devout follower of God and Jesus. He was also an ordained Zen Buddhist priest. So who do Buddhists pray to really depends on who they want to pray to. That's kind of a question each individual has to decide for themselves. But to answer your larger question, you're probably not going to see a picture of Jesus or a cross in a Buddhist temple. However, I've met many people who, like Thomas Merton, blend Buddhist teachings with Christian faith as well. So a bit convoluted, but I hope that answers your question. Allison Griffin says, people are funny though. They hang posters of wolves and romanticize them, but vote against the actual animals. Yes, I agree. People are funny in that way. Like you said, we romanticize wolves. We write entire books on people becoming wolves, but we don't want them in our backyards. And I think part of that goes back to us wanting to eliminate anything that's scary or unpleasant. Even though we'll stay away from people as much as possible, we have this idea that they'll eat us if they're nearby. So we need to eliminate them. We need to kill them off because we view them as a source of suffering. And what this does, once we get on that treadmill, is it just creates more suffering in the natural world, and then by extension, creates suffering for us. So yeah, I agree. People are silly. They do strange things, but we're slowly waking up. David Oliver said, "Good evening, Sensei," with the bow emoji. Good evening, David. Good to see you, friend. Great Hermit said, "How do you deal with religious corruption?" This is a good question. And I think you deal with it the same way you deal with any corruption. You find it, you root it out. The way religious corruption can be identified is very simple. The guide we use is the Buddha and the Buddha's teachings. The Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the Six Perfections. Are we in keeping? Are we in alignment with these things? And if we're not, then we need to come back into the fold. I think part of the reason that religious corruption happens, and unfortunately this has happened in Buddhism as well, is because we lose sight of that. Because we're so enamored by the individual that we almost replace Buddhism with that. And we ignore what the Buddha said because we like what this individual is saying, or what this group of people are saying, this organization. So I think the first way we deal with religious corruption is to pay attention, right mindfulness, right? Seventh tenet of the Noble Eightfold Path. We're seeing the world clearly, we're paying attention, we are mindful of what the Buddha taught, and we hold ourselves and others to account. And when we see corruption, when we see things are not in keeping with what the Buddha taught, we walk away from that. We refuse to take part. Because we're not here to be part of a club, we're here to practice the Dharma. So, without getting too much on my soapbox, that would be my recommendation. Alison Griffin said, "Namo Amida Butsu," with the bow emoji. Namo Amida Butsu, Alison. Thanks so much. Anything else this evening? All right, well, looks like that's it. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate these sessions so much. Oh, Great Hermit said, "How do we practice by ourselves?" Well, ideally, we don't practice by ourselves. It's important to have a Sangha, to have others supporting us in our path. This is an example of finding a Sangha. Whether it's online or in person, when we practice with other people, there's an energy that's sort of a multiplying effect. It's good to meditate and chant by yourself. And I will never tell people to not do that. But in my own experience, meditating and chanting with others can be even more helpful. That being said, if we are in a position where we can't meditate or chant or prostrate or study sutras with others, we study in the same way that we would anything else. We look to the sutras and we study and hold ourselves to what's there. So we meditate, we chant, we prostrate, we study, and we do it by ourselves, and that's fine. Ideally, we can find something either online or in person, but if not, the practice more or less stays the same. The only thing that changes is the number of people. David Oliver said, "Remind me what Namo Amida Butsu means." So Namo Amida Butsu means I take refuge in Amida Buddha. Amida being the Buddha of infinite light. So we have Namu, which is I bow or I take refuge in, and then Amida Butsu is Amida Buddha. Amida Buddha is the Buddha of infinite light who originally was the monk Dharmakara. And through countless kalpas, a kalpa being basically an infinite amount of time. In Buddhist sutras, it's said to be the amount of time it would take for a heavenly deity to wear down a mountain if they came down every 100 years and stroke the top of it with their sleeve. So very, 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 very long time. He practiced for countless kalpas until he fully realized enlightenment, became the Buddha, Amida Buddha, and then used his miracle powers to create the Pure Land, or a Pure Land, which we can go to after we die through the chant Namo Amida Butsu. And this Pure Land is said to be the ideal place to realize enlightenment. So there's two understandings of the teaching. One, like I said, is we go to the Pure Land after we die. The other understanding of the teaching is this world is the Pure Land. And if we practice the Dharma, if we place our faith in Amida, if we bow, chant, meditate, etc., then we will purify our minds to the point where we can see the world around us as the Pure Land, as the ideal place to realize enlightenment. So you can take the teaching either way. Great Hermit said, homage to Amida Buddha. Yes, that is correct. Any other comments or questions for this evening? Great Hermit asks, how much is the metaphysical teachings real or analogy? Well, that depends on what you describe as real. Because as you know, in Buddhism, we're taught that everything is an illusion. An illusion meaning not necessarily that it's not real, simply that it's ever-changing. It's not permanent, right? So I'm an illusion, you're an illusion, my webcam, it's all an illusion. But, so that's the wisdom teaching. The compassion teaching is that life is an illusion, but it's an illusion that we live in. So even if it's not real, we act as if it is, because this is all we have, right? So I know this body is an illusion, but because this illusion feels very real, if I get hungry, I eat food. When I get thirsty, I drink water. So what do we think of as real? Oftentimes when we say real, we're talking about, is it permanent? And nothing in the world is permanent. That being said, the metaphysical teachings of Buddhism, they're as real as we want them to be, as we need them to be. So as I was saying earlier about Amida Buddha and the Pure Land in this life and the Pure Land in the next life, which is real. I try not to get too hung up on that. I ask myself instead, which is useful. Is it useful for me to believe that this world is the Pure Land? Is it useful for me to believe that there's a Pure Land waiting for me after I die? What helps me to better practice the Dharma and realize enlightenment? And I just go from there. When we start to question what's real, what's not real, we can go down some interesting rabbit holes, but not necessarily useful rabbit holes. This world is an illusion, but I sense it. I see it with my senses, so I treat it as if it's real. I've never seen the Pure Land in the afterlife, but it's useful to me in my practice, so I treat it as if it's real, permanent, lasting, and I just go from there. Would delusion be a better translation than illusion? Maybe. So the issue with delusion is it has a bit of a negative connotation to it. So when we say someone's deluded, right, we say they're not seeing things clearly. And there's a negative, you're a deluded person, there's a negative connotation there. If we say it's an illusion, then it's just not what it appears to be. So you'll see both in Buddhist writings. I tend to go with illusion because I don't want to introduce this trap of this world is a delusion. It's negative, but there's something better, a higher plane of existence, so to speak. No, this world is an illusion. It's not what it seems to be, but we're here and it's fine. I enjoy it. I enjoy the trees, the grass, the birds, etc. So let's not make things worse than they need to be. But though, if someone were to say delusion instead of illusion, they would not be incorrect. That would be a good translation as well. Are deities real? That goes back to my earlier answer. A better question would be, are deities useful? So when Kendra Jones asked, do Buddhists pray to God or to Jesus? Well, some of them do, because some of them find the practice useful. Some of them don't, because they don't find it useful. And I think that's fine. Great Hermit also said, I like rabbit holes. I bet rabbits live there. I'm sure they do. Oh, and one other thing. I see earlier you said I only have a few pages left in your book. Well, thank you. Thanks so much. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, lovely. Well, until next time, Amitabha. Well, one more question. Great Hermit said, do prayers work? Well, what do you mean by work? Do we pray for things and things magically appear before us? That hasn't been my experience. However, it has been my experience that when I pray, when I chant, something in me changes. So when I do the metta prayer, the loving kindness prayer, may all beings be happy, may all beings be healthy, may all beings be safe. May all the power of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas protect sentient beings. That changes something in me. So it does work, because I do know that my Buddhist prayers have made me a kinder, more generous, more loving person. Yes. Do they work in the greater scheme of things? I think that's something we'll never know. Just like in the article, the wolves don't know that they're helping the beaver and the elk populations, but they are. We don't know the power of our prayers. We can feel the power of them when it comes to us, but when it comes to other people, that's very much an act of faith, an act of trust, that if we do this thing, this kind and loving thing, that it will be of benefit to others. Great Hermit asks, how much in control do you have in your life, and how much control does outside influences have on you? Well, that depends entirely on you. We have our minds, and through our minds, we decide to an extent, to a fairly large extent, what things affect us and how much they affect us. Right? So I don't know if you can hear this or not, but my neighbor is mowing their lawn. So I don't have any control over them mowing their lawn, but I do control how that affects my thoughts. Do I hear that noise and think, oh, great, the lawn's going to look wonderful when they're done? Do I hear that noise and get annoyed? I'm trying to give a Dharma talk. How dare they? Do I hear that noise and feel some sort of jealousy? Oh no, their lawn will be more impressive than mine. That's all in my head. That's under my control. So there are lots of outside things that happen, But how they affect us, that's up to us. That's what the practice is for, to train our minds so that the outside world has less of an effect on us. Shantideva in The Way of the Bodhisattva said, and I'm paraphrasing, which is better, to cover the world in soft leather so I can walk around barefoot, or to wear shoes so I can walk around and nothing hurts my feet. In Buddhism, we learn to wear shoes so that the outside influences have less of an effect on us. And it's a simple practice, it just takes time. Great Hermit asks, would we have a perfect immortal body once we achieve enlightenment? Well, let's see. So if we are human beings in this life, once we realize enlightenment, and I'm going to be nitpicky here, so we don't achieve enlightenment. It's not something we gain. We realize our own enlightenment. We actualize it in daily life. And once we do that as human beings, we're still human beings. We're just human beings who have actualized our own enlightened nature. Now, the karma from that may result in our next life, us being reborn in a heaven realm in which we could be a celestial being, have an immortal body. We see this in the Vimalakirti Sutra. He was a deeply realized individual who lived in a heaven realm, had the celestial immortal body, and then chose to leave that realm so that he could come to Earth and help other sentient beings realize enlightenment. So probably not in this life, but possibly in the next. What does the Buddha nature look like? It looks like empty space. Any other comments or questions this evening? So is empty means nothing? No, empty means everything. So if you think of the empty space that's around you right now, it holds everything that's in the room, assuming you're in a room. If you go outside, there's empty space. And that empty space holds everything. Our Buddha nature holds everything because it is part of the Buddha body, which holds everything else. How does emptiness create suchness? Well, emptiness doesn't create suchness. Emptiness and suchness are one and the same. Shunyata. So when we talk about emptiness, we talk about letting go of our discursive mind, which cuts things into pieces, and just allowing everything to be everything. One Buddha body. And then everything we see is an aspect of that Buddha body, an aspect of suchness, an aspect of emptiness. How are they one and the same? They are one and the same way that a wave and the ocean are one and the same. We call the wave a wave because that helps us understand it better, but really it's just the ocean. It's just our mind that creates the difference. When we talk about the Dharmakaya, when we talk about Tathagata, when we talk about suchness, when we talk about emptiness, it's all one thing. We just, because we have minds and we like to make things complicated, we separate them out. Have you seen emptiness? Yes, and so have you. Emptiness is all around us. Remember, emptiness isn't nothingness. Emptiness is everythingness. Emptiness is what happens when we stop dividing things into plant, tree, car, person, and everything simply is. This is what we're trying to get to when we meditate. The space between our thoughts is emptiness. It's seeing the world through a different lens. How is the universe made according to Buddhism? So the universe wasn't made according to Buddhism. Traditional Buddhist cosmology says that the universe has always been here and it always will be here, simply in different forms. This goes back to emptiness. We, as human beings, like to cut things into pieces, and it starts here and it stops here, but in reality, everything is simply moving and changing and continuing. The seed is the tree, is the acorn, is the leaf, is the soil. It's all one thing. And we separate it out into pieces so we can understand it better. That's where the illusory nature of the world comes from, which is fine. That's part of being Nirmanakaya and having physical bodies. But when we talk about the universe, we also like to try the same thing. It starts here, it'll stop here. Buddhism doesn't do that. The universe has always been here. The universe always will be here. It'll simply change forms. All right, well, we have a few more minutes. Any other questions or concerns? Beautiful. Thanks so much, everyone. Oh, great hermit. So there will never be an end of the world. Well, this world will end. I think scientists believe that at some point the sun will explode and our galaxy will be destroyed in that explosion. But so yeah, this world will end, but the universe will always be here in some form. How do we accept death? By realizing that it's no different from life. Remember, the seed is the tree, is the leaf. When the leaf dies, falls to the ground, becomes the soil, which becomes the seed, which becomes the tree. All we're doing when we die is we're simply changing forms. That's it. But because we want things to be permanent, because we want things to be everlasting, we suffer with the idea of death because we want to keep things exactly as they are. In order to accept death, we simply have to accept the fact that life is constantly changing. So immortality is constant transformation. Yes. If you want to call it immortality, yes. What is the permanent self? The Tathagata is permanent. The Buddha body. How do you get Buddha body? Well, this goes back to your earlier question about achieving enlightenment. We don't get a Buddha body. We are already part of the Buddha body. Just by existing. The leaf is already part of the tree. It doesn't have to get a tree. We are a leaf on the Buddha body. It's already a part of who we are. The practice is realizing that. And that is simply what we've been doing. The bowing, the chanting, the meditation, the sutra study, the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path. Simply walking the Buddha way will allow us to realize that realize our own enlightenment, realize that we are part of the Buddha body, and then things start to fall into place. Great Hermit said, "Why is death painful?" Well, death is painful for a variety of reasons. One just being, we have neurons and whatnot that sense pain signals. But it's primarily painful because we hold on to things that we shouldn't. Which, to be clear, wanting to live is a perfectly normal, natural thing. I want to live. I enjoy living. But the flip side of wanting to live is knowing that eventually I'm not going to be able to live. And if we're not willing to accept that fact, that death is a natural part of life, then it becomes painful. Just like with the wolves in Yellowstone. We try to remove the wolves from Yellowstone and Yellowstone falls apart. We try to remove death from life. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. So what happens? Life becomes painful. Death becomes painful. This is why the chant Namo Amida Butsu can be useful to some, because they know they're not dying. They're not disappearing. They're simply moving on to a new place, the Pure Land, where they can realize enlightenment fully and completely. Again, is the practice real? Is the practice useful? So faith in the Amida Buddha is one way that we can make death less painful. But primarily death is painful simply because we hold on too tightly to life. It's better to hold on to life, but do it with open hands, understanding that eventually it will go away. Allison Griffin said, "Thank you, Sensei," with the blue heart. Thank you, Allison. Glad this was useful to you. Great Hermit asks, will we always experience aging, sickness, and death? As long as we're human, yes. We should remember that even the deities and the demigods and the gods, they experience birth, aging, sickness, death as well. On a much longer, slower time frame, but it's still there. This is part of existence in samsara. So yes, they will always be part of the equation. However, we learn to deal with them more skillfully. In Amida's Pure Land, for example, death, aging, sickness are essentially gone, which is one of the reasons it's said to be the ideal place to realize enlightenment, because we no longer have those distractions. But even there, they're not gone completely. They just slow down to a point where they just don't worry about it so much. Who will suffer more, the rich man or the poor man? The person who suffers the most is the one who differentiates between the rich man and the poor man. Xavier Mediterranean, aging isn't bad in itself. It becomes suffering if we choose to. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes, you get it. Very insightful. These things simply exist. It's our minds that make them difficult. There's a Zen saying, the way is not difficult for those who don't pick and choose. When it comes to birth, aging, sickness, and death, it's the same thing. These are simply parts of life. It's our minds that decide if they're good or bad. Cutting the grass is simply a part of life. It's our mind that decides, is it good or bad? So in Buddhism, we train our mind so that we can accept these things skillfully. And then they're not a source of suffering anymore. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right. Amitabha.